Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Aliana Kernodle. Pennsylvania's state Supreme Court told counties on Monday that ballots with dating errors cannot be counted as valid. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, what is the background behind this ruling?
This ruling came from an emergency order that the state and Republican National Party had asked for. The counting is still going on in Pennsylvania between U.S. Senator Bob Casey, who's the incumbent Democrat, and Dave McCormick, who is his Republican challenger. The race has been very, very close. I think as of November 21st, which is today, they are, based on unofficial results, roughly 17,000 votes apart, with McCormick being ahead. The reason that this is significant is because there is an argument over what amount of provisional ballots and mail-in ballots that have particular errors should be counted. Now, it's important to note that it's well agreed by McCormick's campaign, by news media, including the AP, that Casey, there's no way that he can make up that gap, no matter how small it is that he is going to lose. Statistically, it is impossible. Every vote that, is provisional and has errors would have to go his way. And even if it did, it really still wouldn't make much of a difference. We can get back into more of that in a little bit. But so the, McCormick campaign, backed by the state and national Republican parties, comes in and wants the state Supreme Court to weigh in again on the particular issue of ballots with no dates or the wrong dates. And this is an issue that's been litigated before, previously when McCormick ran for Senate against Dr. Oz and lost in the primary. And the Supreme Court has said, for varying reasons, that if the ballots do not have the correct dates, that they cannot count. So, unsurprisingly, they reiterated the same thing earlier this week. So the provisional ballots that are still hanging up in the air, they will not be counted. That being said, Casey exercised his right to an automatic recount just because the preliminary results were so close. We're in the middle of that recount right now. And so far, only a couple counties have finished that process, and we're looking at vote differences of maybe 1 to 2 votes here or there. So very small changes so far, but none of these counties were where the candidates were even close. We're waiting for the bigger, more contested counties in southeast Pennsylvania to come in and see how many they got right and how many they got wrong.
And so what were some of the specific concerns that the court addressed in the ruling?
Certainly. So in Pennsylvania, we're still fairly new to counting mail-in ballots. And one of the issues that's kind of come up, since 2020 is that there are voters who come into the precincts on election day and fill out their ballots in front of election workers and then hand them to the election workers. And the reason that they do this is perhaps, they never got their actual mail-in ballot. It was lost in the mail or just came too late, or they were unable to get the mail-in ballot to the county election office before 8 p.m. on election day, or they were worried that they couldn't mail it in time, so they just showed up at the precinct to fill it out. And when they do that, they have to sign it, date it, and put it in a secrecy envelope and then hand it to the election worker. And according to the Casey campaign, the election worker then has to date it themselves, and then it's, done appropriately and it's valid. They are arguing, the Casey campaign, that didn't happen in some cases, and you're looking at thousands of ballots that have a dating error to this extent that they think that it's disenfranchising not to count them, especially when the voter themselves didn't make the error, but that the election worker did. Supreme Court didn't get into that minute level of detail, but what they did say was the dating errors are a problem. You cannot count them, at least not in this election.
And this ruling was 4-3. What was the dissenting opinion?
Sure. So the dissenting opinion, which was 3 Democratic judges, including the Chief Justice on the court, their argument was a little bit more procedural in the sense that they didn't feel that it was necessary to file an emergency order. They felt that there was appropriate avenues through the lower courts that could have handled this. And so their entire premises for why it should have been dismissed was ultimately because of that, not necessarily on the merits of the underlying case. And that is true with earlier litigation that they ultimately weighed in on. Again, with the situation as recently as September, it was a procedural reason. Plaintiffs had come in and said, this dating requirement is disenfranchising. We need to change it. And the Supreme Court struck it down and said the reason that we're not going to weigh in on this any further is because the plaintiffs only filed it in 2 counties, in Philadelphia and Allegheny County, and the Supreme Court needed them to file it in every single county. So they're not really passing judgment on whether the dating issue is something that can make ballots invalid. But really, they are saying the ways that this has been brought to them so far are not sufficient for their involvement.
And some comments by the Bucks County Commission chairwoman have been talked about a lot. What were those, and what did the court have to say about them?
A few days after the election and a few days after Senator-elect McCormick was determined the winner, the Bucks County commissioners held a meeting to decide whether or not these provisional ballots that had these dating errors would count. Even though the Supreme Court's been pretty clear, Bucks County had roughly 400 votes that fell into this category. And the chairwoman, she made some, I don't want to say inflammatory, but she made some very strong comments that really got the attention of the entire country, not to mention the Supreme Court itself, where she said, I think we all know that precedent by a court does not matter anymore in this country, and people violate laws anytime they want. So for me, if I violate this law, it's because I want a court to pay attention. And this really annoyed some members of the Supreme Court, and you can tell because there was a concurring opinion that called this out specifically and was very intent on reminding local officials that they don't have the authority to interpret election law. Only the Supreme Court does. So it's clear that riled, or that really triggered them, for lack of a better word. It's not clear from standing on the outside perspective. Perhaps that was the chairwoman's entire point, was to get them to weigh in quickly, even if she completely disagreed with their decision-making process on this. But it is something that certainly the eyes were already on Pennsylvania in this election from the get-go. Everyone wants to know if Trump or Harris would win. And then the fact that McCormick and Casey are so close is really, people are on edge wanting to know how this is going to turn out. Even though it seems broadly accepted that McCormick will win in the end, it's just an issue that's really brought to light how many shortcomings our election law still has, how many loose ends they need to really tie up before voters feel 100% confident, and perhaps maybe the rest of the country stops putting a microscope on us and what we do in our elections.
Well, Kristen, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.